Like most computer programs, Revit has many user configurable options. In this movie, we're going to talk about the options that affect the overall Revit program. What I mean by that is these are settings that you typically have to set only once and then you kind of forget about them. So you're not going to need to change them every single time you run Revit. Now, one of the things that I want to point out before we open up the options dialog is your Autodesk 360 account. If you have gone to Autodesk.com and set up a user account for yourself, then you have an Autodesk 360 account. This would typically happen if you have Autodesk subscription or if you've just previously logged in and set up an account for yourself. I am currently logged into my Autodesk 360 account, and you can see that right up here at the top of my screen. There's my Autodesk username. If I open this drop-down, I could sign out or I could view my account details. Now, I'm going to just leave myself signed in there right now. If you're signed into your Autodesk 360 account, then what you're going to see is when I go to the big R here, we can access the overall system options down here at the bottom. So I'm going to choose the options button here. And what you're going to see here is that under username in the middle of this options dialog is that same username that you see listed right here. So that is my Autodesk 360 username. Now, where that becomes important is when you're working in team projects in Revit. So if you're working standalone, like frankly we're going to do for most of the movies in this course, it really isn't that important what your username is set to. But if you're working in a team environment where you're working with other members of your firm, then your username becomes kind of important because everybody has to have a unique username. So your CAD or BIM or IT manager would probably make sure that everybody is squared away with this, but I just wanted to point out to you where that occurs. If you sign out of your Autodesk 360 account, then what'll happen here is that this grayed out field will become available and you can actually type in whatever you like there. By default, if you press the Windows key on your keyboard, it's going to use your Windows login. So whatever you're logged into your Windows computer as is what it's going to use if you're not logged into Autodesk 360. So those are your two basic options, Windows login or Autodesk 360. I'm currently logged in with Autodesk 360. Now, right above that is this notifications area. Here you can see two save reminders. If I'm in a standalone project, then my save reminder interval is set right here. If I'm in a team project, my synchronize with central reminder is right here. Both of these are currently set to 30 minutes, which I think for most users is a pretty good interval. You can open the dropdown and change the interval, make it less frequent, make it more frequent. You can even turn it off. I don't recommend turning it off. You want to leave the increment at least to something like 30 minutes to an hour. Somewhere in that range for most projects, I think, is a good setting. The way this works is if that amount of time has transpired and you have not saved, then Revit will pop up a dialog on screen and remind you to save. It usually picks a time to display this dialog when it's somewhat disruptive. In other words, they want to get your attention. So if they had just sort of displayed the dialog when you weren't really noticing, then it wouldn't be very effective. So you're going to get this sort of disruptive dialog. It's going to show up on screen and it's going to remind you to save. After you click save the project in that dialog, then it will go right back to where you left off and continue your work. So I highly recommend that if you see a save reminder dialog appear, you click save the project. Really important to preserve your work. Now, just one or two other things to point out on this tab before we look at some of the other tabs. Work sharing update frequency is again related to a team project. So in a later movie, we're going to talk about how to access a work sharing project, how to access a team project. So we can discuss some of those things in that later movie, but this setting is related to that. Down here under View Options, you have your default view discipline. Now, mine is currently set to architectural, but as you can see, some other disciplines are available there. So if your work is focused more on one of these other disciplines, you can choose that from this list, and that'll have an impact on what sort of tabs and other settings you see in the background there in Revit. On the User Interface tab, you have a few options here that you might be interested in. You can change the active theme from light to dark. You can customize the keyboard shortcuts that are used to access Revit commands. Now, there's all sorts of shortcuts that are built into the program, so you can type keystrokes at the keyboard to run commands instead of clicking buttons and icons. Some people like to customize these, so if you want to change some of those defaults, you click that button right there. Double-click options pertains to just certain commands or certain types of objects that allow you to actually double-click on them to edit. For example, family objects, if you double-click on them, it'll perform this action, or a sketched element, or views, or assemblies, all have these double-click options. Now, the default for families, for example, is if you double-click it to actually edit the family. Now, we're going to talk in detail about families later in the course, but editing the family may or may not be exactly what you want to happen when you double click on it. So I personally prefer to change this to either edit type or do nothing, so that you don't accidentally find yourself in the family editor when you double clicked on an object on screen. So I'm going to set that to edit type and then click OK here. Now, beneath that is the tooltip assistance. Now, this is a really handy setting. I do like leaving it set to the normal option, the one that's already set there. If you turn it to none, it turns off all tooltips altogether. And then there's also a minimal and a high. Now, the way this works is when you hover your mouse over a command, over an icon on screen, it will display a really brief tooltip. If you leave your mouse pausing over that command for just a few seconds longer, then it will go to a more detailed tooltip. So that's what they mean by normal. It starts off with the minimal tooltip, and then after a moment or two, it goes to the high tooltip. If you prefer one or the other, you can choose those directly, or you can just leave it set to normal and control which one you get based on the amount of time you spend hovering over the command. Let me just point out one or two other things here. On the graphics tab, you have lots of user configurable options here. You could turn on and off the hardware acceleration. You can use optimized view. You can smooth lines on 3D views to make them less jaggy. So all these settings are things you can turn on and off. A little tip is that if you find some sort of strange graphical anomalies happening on screen, if something kind of looks a little weird, it doesn't quite look right, I find that a lot of cases that hardware acceleration can be the culprit. Not every video card supports hardware acceleration, so it really depends on your computer, your hardware, whether it can handle it. So if you see things looking a little bit odd on screen, try toggling off the hardware acceleration, and a lot of times that will clear it up. You can also see up here that it will alert you if your video card is out of date, and so maybe I need to go have a talk with my IT manager to get myself up to date. That's basically what you see here in this message. And then down at the bottom, you can change the colors that are used to select things on screen or increase the size of the text that's used for dimensions and so on. One last area I want to point out is under file locations. In the background, I've got the recent files screen open. And if you want to create a new project in Revit, you've got some options over here. And you can see that in my background, I can see architectural template and construction template. That's because these two choices are listed here. If I use this little plus sign icon right here, I can actually add another template to that list, like maybe an office standard template that we've configured for our office. So if you want to build a custom template and have it readily available, then this is the place where you would add it to the list. And then finally down here, you've got some path statements for where other kinds of templates are stored and where your default location for your user files go when you save files and so on. There's certainly plenty of other options in here that we're not going to look at, things like rendering and the view cube and macros. Most of the settings there are set fine for most users out of the box, and you only really need to go there if you find that there's something very specific that you want to change. Keep in mind that everything that I do here in options, once I've set it, I typically can just forget about it. I don't need to change it every single project that I work in. I only need to do it once and then leave it alone until and if I have a reason to change it later.